Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. I talk with a lot of people as part of my research process, and I get from them a clear sense of anxiety and uncertainty about the developments occurring around them. They often describe it as chaotic, confusing, unfamiliar, all signs of change trying to happen. That change is about a major, ongoing realignment of how our world economic system actually works. There is no master plan that I at least can discern, but rather the world adapting to the realities of a world shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, from capitalism to increasingly high levels of socialism, from industrialization to service-centric, and the list goes on. Change is messy. As a consequence, how we finance governments and global trade is also changing. That is what I want to discuss in this session. Our monthly Under the Lens video primarily focuses on macro issues, while our monthly long-wave video focuses on the markets. Since putting out our annual thesis paper on the regulatory state this year, we have focused the Under the Lens videos on macro developments that broaden that focus in general. As such, in this session, we will consider the road we're currently on that we feel will lead towards regulatory repression as an expansion of the macroprudential policies of financial repression. As such, I'd like to discuss the subjects outlined here. We've been talking a lot about economic growth and debt growth recently as the U.S. is about to explode through the $100 trillion level in total debt. The relationship between these two measures of growth and debt and the potential limits to their growth are where we need to start this session with. Total U.S. credit and debt has grown geometrically from $1 trillion in 1964 to breaking through the $100 trillion level in second quarter just completed. Credit is equal to debt over time and is the opposite side of the same coin. Meanwhile, global debt has hit a new record in the first quarter of 2024, increasing by $1.3 trillion in just 3 months to $315 trillion. Since the pandemic, global debt has surged by 21%, adding $54 trillion to the global total. Total global government debt has exploded by $20 trillion since COVID. We had $62 trillion approximately in government debt on a global economy as measured by GDP in 2020 of approximately $84.9 trillion of debt. It will be $82 trillion in 2022 with an expected GDP of approximately $104 trillion. This is $20 trillion of new debt grow the global economy by the same $20 trillion. I've asked this many times, are we growing debt or GDP? It makes you wonder whether we're growing the economy or just debt. Well, that is exactly what has shifted in our global economy to achieve economic growth. U.S. government debt since the advent of quantitative easing has actually been growing faster than the economic growth as measured by GDP. There are profound implications of this occurring that for some reason few discuss and the media completely ignores. As I recently pointed out in an Under the Lens video, in the U.S. it now takes as much as $2.50 of new debt to produce $1 of growth. In the U.S. it takes as much as $1.50 of deficit growth to produce that same $1 of growth. An adjustment crisis can be counted on to occur when debt growth is unable to produce economic growth or is insufficient against the cost of the debt itself. In fact, it is highly likely that debt growth required can itself ever be achieved. We are actually very close to that point. As we discussed in last week's newsletter, we have now reached the point that GDP growth will require debt growth at sufficient levels that even maintaining an inflation level below 3% will be nearly impossible based on the path we're on. Something must change, and of course it will. The world is not coming to an end. We'll show in a moment exactly what that change is most likely to entail. Before we do, however, we need to fully understand the importance of credit creation in today's global economy. My longtime colleague, Richard Duncan, has long held the belief that capitalism, since the U.S. came off the gold standard, has changed to what he terms creditism. He just released a 6-part video series entitled Creditism 101 with an extensive numbers of slides showing the evolution which supports his recent book of the money revolution. This chart from Richard captures the migration since 1968 that he's describing, when the U.S. first initiated the shift from settling its debt in gold to credit IOUs. Today, credit creation accounts for 61% of the funding of U.S. government debt owed. As a consequence, our world has shifted from capitalism, where savings is redeployed as investment in productive assets, to creditism, where credit is deployed as spending on consumption. The black bars have been more or less flat since the late 1990s and the dot-com bubble, and as savings continue to fall, has been made up of financing from the rest of the world, ROW, and the Federal Reserve increasing its balance sheet and bank reserves. The funding of the exploding U.S. government debt has been created by two primary drivers. Domestically, by growth of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and bank reserves, thereby ensuring banks, financial institutions, and investors have the liquidity to buy U.S. Treasury debt. And internationally, by an ever-expanding U.S. trade deficit, which creates foreign currency reserves, or eurodollars, to invest in higher-yielding U.S. Treasury debt. This is most quickly understood by reviewing the concept of the Triffin paradox, which we've discussed previously on many occasions. Both have led to credit growth that has allowed the U.S. to continuously consume far more than it produces for decades now, but yet still realize a rising living standard. It has been nothing short of a game of masterly modern alchemy. With the further advent of quantitative easing, or QE, Ben Bernanke's Enrich Thy Neighbor doctrine, and the stunning increase in the wealth effect, basically a well-disguised Ponzi scheme, has emerged. Like any Ponzi scheme, unless an ever-increasing number of new investors are continuously found, the system will implode eventually on itself. Going forward, obviously, savings is not going to propel further geometric U.S. growth in total credit and debt. It will be lucky to stay flat rather than continue shrinking as a percentage of debt growth. The Fed plus rest of the world contributions, or ROW, is falling as China reduces its holdings of U.S. debt. De-dollarization continues to gain momentum in the application of FX reserves of money-sanctioned targeted countries. Recent selling by Japan, the largest holder of U.S. government debt, to stop a falling yen, along with yen carry trade unwinding, is adding further pressure to existing U.S. debt. Never mind Japan increasing holdings significantly. The U.S. investor is also under mounting pressure as the explosion in net worth versus disposable income has reached historical highs against a 776% versus an average of 550%. All the contributors are simply facing significant headwinds to even maintain their current levels, ever mind significantly and frankly massive levels needed to keep the geometric growth going. But it gets worse, and maybe the single ingredient that forces action sooner than later. That driver is China and the degree of its current slowing of economic growth. I've written about this many times, that it has been China that on 4 separate occasions since the 2008 financial crisis has come to the rescue of a global economy facing troubles. The Chinese credit impulse has delivered the massive new credit and debt to further power a global economy facing ever-increasing imbalances between creditor and debtor nations. China is in the midst of its worst economic crisis in decades. The property market, accounting for roughly a quarter of economic activity in China, is facing an oversupply of empty apartments at an inconceivably large scale, meaning that all activity in this industry should, but won't cease. The other pillar of Chinese economic strategy, that is export-led growth, is also under severe strain because the rest of the world is simply no longer willing to absorb China's glut of manufacturing goods, or maybe say it is incapable of continuing to absorb it. So China is facing a demographic nightmare. Its population is shrinking and is widely expected to contract by at least 1/3 by the end of the century. Government debt will have to skyrocket over the coming decade to prevent China's economy from collapsing into a Great Depression, just as the Japanese government debt has since Japan's economic bubble popped in the 1990s. The grave economic challenges confronting China were discussed in last October's UnderTheLens video entitled, "Can China Rescue the World Once Again?" The truth is, China may need the world to soon help it. The world is facing a looming financial problem due to a lack of growth, of encumbered collateral. That's the problem. Credit is not extended and debt incurred without collateral being posted to secure the debt. This is now the limiting critical factor. As I've written many times, collateral is real wealth. You must either grow it, mine it, produce it, or build it. You can't print it. Paper IOUs are only claims on real wealth. They themselves are not wealth. Honoring those claims in tumultuous times often depends on solvency and continuing operations of intermediaries, third parties, and banks. There's tremendous risk with that paper. Today, the vast amount of paper wealth is highly dependent on the vagrancies of the highly leveraged quadrillion-dollar derivatives market. Claims which can suddenly be worth nothing. There are endless examples of this. As an example, however, today's markets are operating and trading on creative vehicles such as collateral swaps, collateral transformation, and liability derivatives, to just name a few. The latter recently brought down the British Prime Minister to guilt and almost sent the UK pension industry into collapse, without anyone being aware of what was going on in the global derivatives market before it suddenly arrived on the scene one day. It has made everyone much more aware of the problems with rehypothecation and novation of the collateral that's currently going on. But we've yet to really pay the piper, frankly. What are the consequences and conclusions from this? What should we expect? We can expect the government to soon, if they're not already actually doing this, to begin the use of off-balance sheet accounting using contingent liability guarantees. The U.S. has long used this process for foreign aid. The U.S. doesn't necessarily always give the foreign aid directly, but rather guarantees of the loans banks make to these countries receiving the aid. The aid comes with terms that if defaulted on, loans become due, and the U.S. is then on the hook for payment if the defaulting country can't or won't make settlement. It's only then that it goes on the U.S. general ledger. In 2015, Professor Lawrence Kotlikoff presented to the Senate Budget Committee the fiscal gap, which he recalls it, which includes U.S. government contingent liability, totals $210 trillion. Let me repeat that number. $210 trillion of off-balance sheet contingent liabilities and other vagrancies. His report is still currently available online. Pretty soon governments will be in the guarantee game to ensure that ever-increasing credit and debt streams are generated to keep the Ponzi scheme from imploding. It is not a matter of if, it's a quick question of when, and maybe it's already happening. In response to future crises and the disruptions, we should expect the state to additionally resort to drastic measures such as imposing price and capital controls, nationalizing banks and large corporations, and transforming the economy into a highly regulated command economy. As I close the video, I see that Vice President Kamala Harris has just announced price controls as a pillar of her economic plan to counteract rising food prices. These developments may be sooner, actually, than we're currently even thinking. There is little doubt in my mind that regulatory repression will soon be an addition to the long-practiced macroprudential monetary policy of financial repression. We will continue to outline developments regarding advancing regulatory repression in our weekly newsletters. As I always remind you in these videos, remember politicians and central banks will always print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still fortunately in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there's actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not necessarily following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2024 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.